Okay. Oh, thank you. Do remember to get your midterm exam in. And tonight, you should have an attachment to the email link that I sent you. That's the attachment right there on the table. This is some information. We're going to go over this just briefly before we get to 2 Samuel. This is information about writing research papers and term papers and things like that. This is what we had talked about briefly last week or a couple of weeks ago in terms of some reference material. And what this is actually three chapters from a different course that I just kind of lifted out to use for this. A lot of our students, this is the first time they will have written research papers or term papers, at least since high school. And a lot of times students don't really understand what a research paper is or what a term paper is. And when we talk about a manuscript or a research paper, we're talking about what amounts to scholarly writing. And that's writing that is not just to express your opinion about something, writing that is not just to persuade, but specifically writing that is designed to show what you have learned about a particular subject. That's what a research paper or term paper is. It's writing that shows what you have studied and learned. And the purpose of a term paper or research paper is for the student to pick a topic and then go and collect information from reputable sources about that subject and learn about it and organize what they learn and then present it. And the whole point of a research paper is to introduce this topic, explain what it is, explain what information you found and how it fits together, and then give a conclusion, what you've learned basically about it. A couple of things to avoid. Number one is plagiarism. And plagiarism, the simplest definition of plagiarism is stealing somebody else's work, stealing somebody else's ideas. You know, when you're in 3rd grade and the teacher assigns you that first book report that you have to do, and oh man, how do I do a book report? And you go to the library and you discover a book with a dust jacket that has a little blurb on the back that tells a little bit about the book, and you just copy that down word for word and hand that in as your book report. That's plagiarism. That's stealing what somebody else wrote and passing it off as your own. So you want to avoid that. You also want to avoid excessive quotations. Now, quoting what somebody else said is fine, especially if they make a good point or if they're giving authoritative information about something. Quoting that is fine, but you don't want to quote pages and pages and pages. You want to get the nugget of information, the summary that makes the point, and quote that. Now we'll talk about formatting a research paper, putting it in its proper organization. And all in the world of format is, and there are different formats. There's Chicago Manual of Style, or Turabian, as it's usually called. And there's Modern Language Association and American Psychological, all these other formats. A format is just a set of rules or set of principles so that you present your information in a consistent way. It does 3 things basically. The format organizes the information into a readable form, and it gives the reader information about where you got your information from. It lets them go back to the original sources of your information if they want to. And it keeps the writer, keeps the student honest by requiring legitimate, checkable sources. Now, if you look at this outline on page 2, there's some general guidelines, some basic rules for how you present the information. You would, if you're going to write it, you handwrite it on one side of the paper only. If you're going to print it on a computer printer, you print on one side of the paper only. You double space, except for quotations, which are normally single spaced. You put an inch margins all the way around. If a manuscript was long enough that you were going to bind it, you'd put 1.5 inches on the left-hand side. A lot of teachers will require note cards. And what that is a group of index cards where you note down information, quotes, or page numbers or things from sources that you research and who the sources are. I don't require you to hand in note cards, but if you're going to use note cards in your research, here are the things that you ought to note down: the author and the title of the book or the article or what have you, who published it and all that, what page it's on. And if you're going to make a direct quotation, you got to write that down, make sure you get it word for word. Otherwise, it's not a quotation. Another thing that you find in term papers or research papers are footnotes or end notes. And that's the information that you put in at the bottom of the page or at the end of the paper. If you start out using footnotes, a footnote goes at the bottom of the page, and the end note goes at the end of the paper. I don't care what you use, just be consistent. If you start with footnotes, stick with footnotes. If you start with end notes, stick with end notes. You would footnote.
Say that again.
If you start using footnotes, which are at the bottom of each page, whenever you make a quotation or something like that, use that format all the way through. If you use end notes, which is the same information, but it's all at the end of the paper, stay there, do that. Don't switch back and forth.
We can have one paper that says these are the books and the notes and the places of where we got this.
That would be the end notes. Yes.
That's the end note.
Yeah.
Do we have to tell exactly where it is in our paper, or just as long as we we used it?
No, when you use when you put in a quotation, for example, you would now Bible verses. It's another story. But if you quote from a book, you quote 2 or 3 sentences or a short paragraph or something, word for word. At the end of that quotation, you would put a superscript number, a little upper number that corresponds either to a footnote, which has the same number, and that footnote gives the author of the book and the name of the book and who published it and what page that quotation's on. And that would go at the bottom of the page, or if you're using end notes, all of those would go at the end on one page that says end notes.
Which is more preferable, that you have the end notes, you have it at the end notes?
If you use Turabian's way of organizing a paper, she uses footnotes at the bottom of a page. Modern Language Association, most colleges now prefer end notes. I don't care.
Meaning if you said something, put the note where you got it and found it right there.
At the bottom of that page. That's a footnote.
Or not so much. I don't mean to hold the class up, but
no problem.
What I'm saying is, if I say Jonathan I got this out of book A, and I say that I got it out of book A, is that enough?
In the text?
In the text.
Well, no, then you would give the publishing information for that book in the footnote. Who the author was, what the title of the book was, who published it, where it was published, when it was published, what page it was on. Because if you're quoting from for example, if you're quoting from William Sanford Lasore, Old Testament Survey, well, that's great, but there's 860 pages. And, you know, the person is not going to have time to go through 860 pages to find it. So you need to tell them, what page was it on?
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. And you do that in the footnotes. Now, all of that information, almost all of that information is also going to be included in the bibliography, which is the list of books you used or the list of sources you used.
That's called the list of bibliography.
Yeah, that's the bibliography.
It's not gonna say the reference books.
Right. So what do you footnote or what do you endnote? If you quote directly, you put that reference. If you make a reference to what somebody wrote, but you don't quote it directly, you just kind of say, Isaac Asimov said thus and such and so in this and that book. You've paraphrased what he said. You should go ahead and put a reference to that book and to the page where what he said is found, even though it's not a direct quotation. Now, if it's something that could legitimately be considered common knowledge, you know, a hammer is used to drive a nail. You don't really need to footnote that. That's common knowledge. That's what a hammer's for. Generally speaking, additional information, you can read this for yourselves. General rules. If you're going to quote somebody, just quote the pertinent statement. Don't give 5 paragraphs word for word.
Only what pertains.
Just quote the main point. Keep your quotes brief. You know, don't just stick a quotation in the middle of your paper without any context. If you're going to quote what W.E. Vine, who is a Greek scholar, says about the word baptizo, which is baptism, then lead into that. W.E. Vine says so-and-so about baptism. And this is information here in the notes. Now, sometimes you're going to have a quotation where the point that you're trying to make is part of the first part of a paragraph and part of the last part of the same paragraph, but you don't want to put all the middle stuff in. The point is the first few words and the last few words. Well, you can use an ellipsis in the middle of that. That's those 3 dots where, you know, you go dot, 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 and then pick up in the middle of the sentence. And that tells the reader, me, that there's more to this quotation, but here's the part that matters, this first part and this last part. And that's acceptable, that's permissible. And sometimes in the middle of a quotation, you may need to explain something yourself. And so you put brackets, those little square brackets in, and what you're explaining, you put in those brackets, and that tells whoever's reading it, okay, here's the quotation, and I'm explaining this part of it. There are some online sources to help you with all of this information, and there are references there on page 3 in these notes that give you those web addresses where you can go. Now, if you'll flip over to page 4 in these notes, I want to just real briefly kind of go over some thoughts about how you organize information to present it, to express it clearly. 4 things you need to know before you ever sit down and start writing. Number 1, what are you writing about? What's your topic? You know, it's sometimes folks will sit down and start to write without really knowing where they're going. They're just stringing words together, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. What's your topic? What information have you learned about this subject? All right, I've learned this and this and this and this. Great. What are you trying to tell me, the reader, about this topic? What's the point of what you've learned? And that's That's where you transition in your writing from introducing your subject to demonstrating what you've learned about it to, all right, here's what you ought to get out of this, Mr. Reader. Here's the application of it. And then you need to summarize the whole thing. There's a process to writing a term paper or a research paper. And a lot of times students will get hung up by trying to write the paper in order from start to finish. When you sit down and start to write the body of your paper first. Don't start with the introduction. Write the body of your paper where you have, okay, here's, my topic is this, and here's what I've learned about this topic. And here's the conclusion. Here's what it taught me about it. Here's how it all fits together. And write the body of the paper, and then write the conclusion, and then go back and write the introduction, because the introduction should only be maybe a page long, 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe 4 paragraphs, because the introduction is exactly that. It just introduces the subject and kind of outlines what the whole paper is going to be about. Now, the whole purpose, let me close this door. I don't know what all we've got going on down here.
Yeah, they got a class, they got
The young people have got something going on, I think.
program going on.
Yeah. So the whole purpose of research and writing a term paper is to gather relevant information about your subject, identify what's important and what's not. Sometimes you'll find information about your subject that really has nothing to do with what you're writing about. And so you want to weed out what doesn't relate to your subject and summarize it into a usable message. It's a research paper, a term paper is not a sermon. You're not writing to persuade me of something or to show me how you would present this material to an audience. You're writing to show me what you've learned about this subject. What, in the case of a religious research paper, you're writing to show me what you've learned about what the Bible says on this or that subject and related information to that. If there's historical information about Samuel, for example, we're writing a paper about Samuel. Well, the Bible tells you who he is. He's the son of Hannah and Elkanah, and he was their first son. And there's some background there that in 1 Samuel. But if there's some historical information or some archaeological information that you have found, if that relates to what you're writing about, or if you're writing about Samuel as a judge, for example, if there's information about the other judges that you can compare him with some of the other judges in the Bible, okay, that's relatable, that's pertinent information. So you would want to bring that in and point that out. But it's not about trying to persuade me, it's trying to show what you learned about this subject, basically. And you've got to learn where to look. Well, obviously, you're going to look in the Bible, and there are religious reference books, whole list of them in this information that I've given you, a whole list of kinds of books. And there is a very good library literally across the hall. You'd need to get with Paul. You'd need to get well, Tommy, to get access to it because it's locked up right now. But it's for the school's use. But where to look for information and what to do with it when you find it. How to evaluate that information. Is it authoritative or is it just somebody's opinion? My opinion doesn't count for anything. But if I am an expert on something and I can document that I am an expert, then what I say on that subject, that may have some weight. Now, the Bible's words should always carry more weight than what a commentator says. If a commentator says, you don't have to have faith for God to save you, well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible's going to outweigh that commentator because the Holy Spirit is the author of the Bible. You want to look at outside biblical sources, not Bible, but extra biblical sources, and weigh their accuracy. Is what this writer or that author says, is that actually true? Is it consistent with the Bible, or does it clash with the Bible? And then, is it relevant? Is it useful? Does it actually relate to your subject, or is it just an interesting tidbit of information? Understand your purpose. You're writing to consider this particular subject. And that's why you organize what you write so that the reader goes from the initial question or the initial subject through what you've learned about it, the major things that you've learned about it, to this is the conclusion that brings you to. Now, when you sit down to write your term paper, a lot of times the most helpful thing you can do is take a piece of paper or a pad and just kind of outline first. I want to make this point and this point and this point, and I want to draw this conclusion and this conclusion, just a couple of sentences. And then you can kind of go back and maybe put a sentence or two for an introduction. And what that does is that gives you a framework for when you actually sit down and start to flesh out the bones and fill in and write your actual paper. That just kind of keeps you on track. Think of it as sort of a homemade roadmap. So that when you sit down and start to write, you've already kind of planned out where you're going in your writing. And that you can look at that and say, oh, this reminds me, I need to make this point. No, that doesn't relate. I can leave that out. And that will keep you focused on what you're actually doing. Now, the next page or two gives you some examples of standard references for a term paper. And these are just books that were on my library shelf at home, things that are illustrations. I want to talk about two other things about writing term papers and research papers. One is clear purpose. And I'm kind of beating this horse a little bit on that. Clear purpose. For a lot of student writers, the hardest part of writing is figuring out what you actually want to say. I can't tell you how many papers I've read through the years where, the paper says, I'm writing about thus and such. And the student never actually quite gets to that subject. They just go all around it and never quite get to it and actually explain it. Before you sit down and start writing, after you've done your reading, done your studying, gone and found information and learned about this subject, sit down and ask yourself, what have I learned? And maybe make a couple of notes about that. I learned this. I didn't know this about this subject, or what have you. That will help to keep you focused on writing on that subject. Plan what you write. Write it. And then before you hand it in, read what you've written. A lot of times I'll tell students, when you finish your term paper, before you hand it in, go sit down in front of the mirror and read it out loud to yourself. Because before you get to the bottom of the first page, you're going to be reaching for a red pen to cross out this and to reword that and make it flow better. And you're going to realize, oh, I meant to say this, but I actually said that. I need to correct that, or you'll find mistakes. So plan what you write it, then read what you wrote and go back and rewrite it, because it'll be 10 times better the second time. There's a lot of information here. You can read this for yourself. I'm not going to go through this word for word. Some general principles. When you write, try to keep your sentences short and simple. Think about it. How many people read the editorial page in the paper? Anymore, how many people actually read the paper? But how many people read the editorials compared to the funnies? Now, I'm that throwback. I read the paper every day. I read the newspaper. And I look at every page. I don't read every page, but I look at every page. And I get to the editorial page, and you know the first thing I look at on the editorial page? The editorial cartoons. Because they're short and they make a point. A lot of times the editorial is, 5 columns of blah, 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 blah. And I'll read about the first paragraph and no, I'm not interested in this, and turn the page. When I get to the funnies, I read, I'm very faithful. There's one that I don't read. I don't care anything about life as a cat or whatever it is. But they make their point with just a few words. That's good writing. Try to keep your sentences short and to the point. Try to write so a 6th grader can understand what you're writing. If you think about it, the cartoon strip Peanuts, Charlie Brown, Charles Schulz made his mark in history with that comic strip using the vocabulary of a 1st grader. Because Charlie Brown and Lucy and Linus and Peppermint Patty and Sherman and all these characters, they're 1st graders. Forever 1st grade. Every now and again, you find a little higher language in there. Most of the time, everything they talk about with 1st grade words. And that's part of its appeal. It's easy to understand. Now, you have a little sample on page 8 of an outline. And one of the simplest pieces of information I can give you about an outline is that when you have a major point that you want to make, then any illustrations or any minor points for that point need to relate to that point. And then you go on to the next point. And anything that goes with that needs to relate to that. You don't just sort of string them out there randomly. There needs to be order. So that's clarity of purpose. Write so that your purpose is obvious. The other thing is what we could call clarity of expression. And that's the rest of these notes here from page 9 to page 13. And in a nutshell, that comes down to try to choose simple words. Try to use direct sentences. One of the things that students fall into is using passive verbs. I have done my homework. Well, have done is a passive verb. I did my homework. We just said the same thing, but now it's an active verb. It's me doing it. Have done, that's kind of roundabout. Try to speak directly. Try to be as clear, as simple. A lot of times students will write in academic speak. which is using as many words as possible to say as little as they can. And all that does is make it more work. Well, you've got some illustrations there. But the point is to make what you write concise, which is short, cut out stuff that you don't need, and cohesive so that it sticks together, and coherent. And that's where it sticks together in order and makes sense. So that's the lesson for tonight about writing a term paper. And like I say, you got 12 or 13 pages of information there. And that's not, there's no assignment here. That's just meant to be helpful information. And you can read over that. If you have questions about it, just call me or email me. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you have. But that's to help you try to understand how to organize your term papers. Those of you who are taking the class for credit and writing a research paper, writing a term paper. So, questions about that?
Thank you for taking the time to present this to us. It's very good. Thank you.
You're welcome, Rex. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think you've actually had a lot of this material in a previous class, but this is kind of a summary of it. Now, let's get to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel basically is all about David as king. 24 chapters. It is the chronicle of David's reign as king over Israel. It is the fulfillment. David's rulership is the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham that Israel's borders, that the promised land would reach these boundaries. Remember that when we talked about the book of Judges, and even at the beginning of 1 Samuel, the nation of Israel had not occupied all of the territory that they could have had, because in some way, each of the 12 tribes had stopped short of fully conquering the territory God promised them. In fact, the Danites never did possess some of the territory they were supposed to possess, and wound up going and colonizing territory halfway across the country that was never really intended for them at all. But under David's rule, when the nation is united again, they're going to be divided for 7.5 years after the death of Saul. But when the nation is fully united under David, then the boundaries of the kingdom expand. The Philistines and the Edomites and the Moabites that are around the fringes, that are constant problems, David is going to defeat them and bring them into submission. And now the boundaries of the kingdom are going to expand to include all of that territory, basically. And then in Solomon's day, when we get to Kings and Chronicles, we'll see it expand even more and take in territory that was actually not even part of what God had promised. But that's how far Solomon's influence will extend. Now, 2 Samuel, the story of David as king, is in some ways an argument, a proof from start to finish of the inspiration of the Bible. Because 2 Samuel paints a picture of David. David, Israel's greatest king. And what does Samuel show us? What does 2 Samuel show us about Israel's greatest king? Boy, he had clay feet. He was a great king, but he had clay feet. He made some glaring mistakes. He sinned in some spectacular ways, even though he's God's man. So he is not a perfect ruler. He's not a perfect man by any stretch. And so he falls into sin, he falls into temptation, he gives in, his ego gets the best of him at times, and his own family winds up in chaos at times because of his sins. Absalom, his own son, is going to lead a murderous civil war rebellion against him. Now it's going to end up in Absalom dying rather than David. But that's a direct result of David's sins. God promised you'll never have peace among your children because of what you've done with Bathsheba. And sure enough, Amnon and Tamar and Absalom, misery in some respects within his own family, his own house. So we get to the beginning of 2 Samuel, and it picks up right where 1 Samuel left off. It's really this ought to be just one big long book, the book of Samuel, but it's divided here, and it picks up with the death of Saul. After the death of Saul, David returns from striking down the Amalekites. Now remember, Saul dies in battle against the Philistines, and David is nowhere nearby. David has returned from where they're having the battle to Ziklag, which is in Philistine territory, and discovered that while all the men were away, the Amalekites that were supposed to have been wiped out, the Amalekites have come to play and raided and burned the city and kidnapped all the women and children and taken everything of value. And so he and his men go and rescue their families and all the stuff that was taken. They're halfway across the country from where the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites is taking place. They're way down in the south, and the Philistines are up in the midsection of the country having a war with Israel. So David doesn't know anything about Saul being defeated. David doesn't know anything about Saul dying, taking his own life, or anything like that. Time is passing here. Some days have to pass for all of the word to get around. David has returned from striking down the Amalekites, and he's at Ziklag, in the ruins of Ziklag. And after 2 days, now on the third day, now they begin to get word. Here's a man from Saul's camp, clothes torn, dirt on his head. Now, we look at the image here, and we go back and look at the end of 1 Samuel. What was going on at the end of 1 Samuel as far as Saul was concerned? We're in battle. We're in war. Chaos, blood, mud, dirt, all this going on. And this young man, this man is coming from that scene. And so he's dirty and his clothes are torn. But notice the description here. It says he came with his clothes torn, dirt on his head. He's not just filthy and bedraggled from being in battle. To the Hebrew mind, his appearance, his clothes aren't just torn from battle. His clothes are torn on purpose. He tore his clothes. And his head is dirty, not because he got knocked down in the dirt, but because he has put dirt and ash on his head. In the Hebrew mind, this is a very visible public evidence of grief, of mourning. To tear the clothing, that's an open way of showing someone that they were in mourning, that they were in grief for some reason. So he comes to David, falls to the ground, and pays homage to him, or worships him. Some translations would say, not worships him like God, but he bows down to him as a superior. Really, he bows down to him as king, because David is going to become the next king. He's already been anointed. And David asks, where have you come from? What's going on? You know, think about this. David and his men were dismissed by the Philistines. We don't want you around. Go away. Where do they go? Well, they go back home, as much as Ziklag is home. And they get there, and what do they find? They find a smoldering ruin, no women, no children around, all the valuables are gone, and they figure out the Amalekites took them. So they chase after them. They have their own battle, demolish the Amalekites, rescue their women and children, bring all their stuff back. This is over a period of several days. They get back, they're camped basically in the ruins of a burned out city. They've got their own grief. They've got their own hardships and difficulties that they're already dealing with. And now this man appears and he's got signs of mourning. And what do they know about Israel and the Philistines? They were going to battle. They know there's been a war going on, a battle going on, but they don't know anything about the outcome of it yet. And when an Israelite shows up with dirt on his head and his clothes torn, with all of the visible signs of grief and mourning, ooh, this does not look good for our side. This looks like our side lost. So the young man comes and pays homage to David. Where have you come from? I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Well, that doesn't sound good. How did it go? How did the battle go? Tell me. It didn't go well. It did not go well. Well, the people fled. All right, that tells David right there, our side lost. Many of the people have fallen. Ooh, we've got a lot of casualties. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. What? The king, God's anointed, and his son, oh, by the way, who's his son?
Jonathan.
David's best friend in the whole wide world. Oh. Saul and Jonathan are dead. What does David do? Verse 5, how do you know? Basically, are you sure? He's not, at this point, he's not worried about how do you know we lost the battle or how do you know we've got a lot of casualties. He's very specific. How do you know Jonathan and Saul are dead? I was there. I was there. I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. There was Saul leaning on his spear, chariots, horsemen close upon him. He looked behind him. He saw me. He called to me. Who are you? I'm an Amalekite. Stand beside me and kill me. Anguish has seized me, yet my life still lingers. And now look what the fellow says. So I stood beside him and killed him because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet, the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord. What's this man done?
Killed the king.
Except that he didn't kill the king. Go back and look at the end of 1 Samuel. Who killed the king?
Yeah, he did.
Saul told his wife. And
Yep.
there's no record of him asking this fellow to do anything because the armor bearer, the guy that Saul did say, take my life, he wouldn't do it. And then when Saul took his own life, what did the armor bearer do?
The same thing.
Go back to chapter 31, verse 5. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So this guy is lying through his teeth. Why? He's got Saul's crown and he's got Saul's bracelet. Evidently, he was there. But what's he doing? He's making himself out to be a hero.
Or so he thought.
He is no hero. He is no hero. Anguish has seized on me, or some translations say a cramp has seized on me. In other words, I can't go on. verse 9. And so here's what I did, David. I brought them to you, my Lord. Well, the only part of what he told that was true was that Saul and Jonathan were dead, and he brought the crown and the bracelet. Everything else was a lie. So you pick up in chapter 1 at verse 11, and how does David react? All the actions of mourning, tore his clothes, and grieved. So did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan, his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. They didn't die natural death. They were slain in battle. They mourned. Now think about this. David mourned for Saul, who had hunted him like a mad dog, who had tried and tried and tried to murder him. And David mourned for him. A lot of us would have looked at that and said, about time, good riddance. What took you so long, Lord? And David was not that kind of man. He mourned for, it's natural that he would mourn over Jonathan. Jonathan's his best friend. But he mourned over Saul as well. And they mourned over the people that died with Saul. Think about this. Why did those people die with Saul? Because Saul turned away from the Lord. As long as Saul was with the Lord, he had success in battle, didn't he? And when he turned away from God, when his ego got so big that he couldn't, there wasn't room in his head for himself and God, so he kicked God out. When his heart got so hard, then he started to lose. And because of his turning away, everybody else that died in this battle died because of Saul. So they mourn. And now you get down here to about verse 13. David asks, who are you, the young man? Who are you? Well, I'm a stranger. I'm the son of a sojourner. I'm an Amalekite. You want to talk about being the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the definition of that. Not only is this guy an opportunistic liar. I mean, you bring the crown and the bracelet to the guy that's been anointed to be the next king, and you're the one that brings him the crown. What do you kind of expect he's going to do? Give you some kind of a reward, give you a promotion or something. But then on top of that, you're not even an Israelite. You're an Amalekite. And you have just spun out a story that is not true, and it flies in the face of everything that David had done when he had the opportunity to kill Saul himself and didn't. But then on top of that, an Amalekite, not even supposed to be alive in the first place. Saul was supposed to have wiped out you and all your people back there years ago in 1 Samuel chapter 15, and he didn't do it. So you're not even supposed to be here. But then on top of that, David and his men just came back from where? From a war with Amalekites who had plundered their city, trying to take advantage of their absence. So, being an Amalekite in this situation That is not a good person to be. You know,
Unpopular.
that's like that scene in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Where the guys show up at the Klan rally with a black friend.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, he is not the right guy to be there. This is not good. You know what? I think I have not been recording this. Yes,
Oh,
Oh, no.
I saw it.
It is running. I
Yeah, it's
thought-
recording. Uh-huh.
recording. Okay, so everything about this is stacked against this guy, and we want to say, you know, it's stacked against this poor guy. Except, no, he's not a poor guy. He's an idiot. He's lying through his teeth. He's trying to take advantage of the situation, and so he has claimed that he's the one that killed Saul.
Mm.
All right. How is it that you were not afraid to kill him? How is it that you did not have enough respect to refrain from killing him? Now, he lied about it in the first place. He didn't kill him. So in one sense, it's like, why would you want to claim you did something like that? But David seemingly doesn't know that the guy is lying. He takes him at face value. You killed Saul. How is it that you had the nerve to do that? And so you, one of my servants, come here. Strike him down. Kill him. Execute him on the spot.
Mm.
And David said, in verse 16, you brought it on yourself.
Mm.
You testified against yourself. You said it yourself. I have killed the Lord's anointed. Not up to you to do that. Okay, you get the penalty of that. Did David ever know that the man lied?
Probably not.
The inspired writer clearly did. So maybe at some point David would have learned that, but even so, the man receives basically just punishment for claiming that,
Mm.
actually do it. So David had verified who he is. He's an Amalekite. He's a stranger in Israel. He's a stranger in Israel, which implies that he had accepted the law, that he had agreed to live under the law of Moses. Well, if he did, he had no right, even if the king commanded him, he had no right to strike down Saul. Now, the fact that it's a lie just multiplies the issue here. So you pick up at verse 27 or verse 17, and from verse 17 down to verse 27, you have David's lamentation over Saul and Jonathan. The rest of the chapter is David's eulogy, basically, for Saul and Jonathan. And notice a couple of things that are said here. He lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, his son, and he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. Behold, it is written in the book of Yashar, the book of the upright, as some translations put it. So that tells us, by the way, that the inspired writer of 2 Samuel or of Samuel evidently had access to that book, could consult it. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offering, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, The bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. And he goes on like this. The song of the bow, all of these images of warfare, all of these images of combat. Don't give the enemy reason to rejoice over us. You get on down here, he talks about the mountains of Gilboa, let it be dry, let it be a drought. Even nature should mourn. Now, he says, clearly Saul and Jonathan took many lives also. They fought uprightly. And even though they were different, they were cut from different bolts of cloth. You know, Jonathan was upright and Saul was not. Get down here to verse 23. And Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were not divided. They were not on the same page with respect to the kingdom. Jonathan had sworn his loyalty to David for the day that David would become king. But even though father and son were on different pages in that respect, they were united for Israel in life and in death. And he goes on, remember all the good that they did, the loot, the blessings, the things that they brought. And then weep over them, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Now, verses 25 and 26 speak only of Jonathan. Jonathan lies slain in your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. Now, there's parallelism here. Both of these, the mighty, represent these two as heroes, but here, the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war perished. David is pointing out the difference in the way that Saul and Jonathan had behaved toward him. He's mourning for Saul, but it was Jonathan who had been his loyal, faithful friend. Your love was better to me than the love of women. There's nothing physical about this. This is about friendship. This is about loyalty and commitment. And he was as faithful as he could be in that respect. So come then down to chapter 2, and here from chapters 2 to 4, chapters 2, 3, and 4, David is going to be anointed as king at Hebron, or Hebron. And Hebron is in the territory of Judah. It's in the south. And at this point, for the next 7.5 years, David will be king over Judah, and practically speaking, over Benjamin and bits and pieces of Ephraim that bordered Judah, parts of Simeon and so forth. But in practical terms, he's the king of Judah, not the king of all of Israel, because one of Saul's surviving sons, Ishbosheth, will be crowned by Abner, Saul's commander, his general, to be Saul's replacement. Abner had been, to a large degree, the power behind the throne, not in political things, but in military things for Saul. And he wanted to hold on to that position and to that influence. He can control Ishbosheth because he was Saul's uncle. He's Ishbosheth's great uncle. He's got family tie. He's got influence. He wants to hold on to all of that. So for the first 7.5 years of David as king in Judah, you got Abner using his great nephew basically as a puppet to try to hold on to control in the rest of Israel. So you got a little bit of a divided kingdom right here. Pick up in chapter 2. After this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? Go up. Where shall I go? Go to Hebron. So he goes to Hebron, and when he gets there, he takes his wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, and he brought up his men who were with him, everyone, and they lived in the towns of Hebron, the surrounding area. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now, why didn't they anoint him king over Israel?
Saul.
Well,
Israel wasn't united at that time. They were
okay,
kind of spread about.
Saul had been king over all Israel, but Saul was dead. These are the elders, these are the leaders of the tribe of Judah. They can't speak for the whole rest of the nation. They can only speak for their own tribe. And as we see going down, Abner is trying to play his own game. We'll get to that in just a minute. But notice the order of events here in these first few verses. David mourns in chapter 1. Chapter 2, before he takes any positive action on his own, what does he do? Ask God. Go to God first. Lord, what should I do? Should I go back into my home territory, go back to Judah? Yes, go. So he goes to Hebron. The elders of Judah, the men of Judah, they come, they anoint him to be their king. Now, he's already been anointed by Samuel, and some of them undoubtedly know that. So he's entitled to be king. Well, now that Saul is out of the way, okay, let's carry this out. You will be our king. And word comes that it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who had rescued the body of Saul and his sons and buried them, burned the carcasses and then buried the bones. And so David sends them a thank you. He sends them a present, as it were, a gesture of appreciation, sent messengers to them. May you be blessed by the Lord because you showed this loyalty to Saul, your Lord, and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness, or kindness and truth. It's interesting. Literally, the figure of speech here is grace and truth. Forgiveness, that's the object of grace, and faithfulness, that's the object of truth. So may the Lord extend to you these things. And notice he says, I will do good to you because you have done this thing. Now, where is Jabesh Gilead? Jabesh Gilead is not Judah's territory. It's Benjamin and Ephraim's territory. I will do good to you because you've done this. Let your hands be strong, be valiant. Saul, your Lord, is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So, all right, fellas, I'm on your side. I'm for you. I appreciate what you did. But pick up at verse 8, verses 8 through 11. Ishbosheth becomes king over Israel, not because he has any claim to it, not because he's been anointed, not because God's will can't be done, but because Abner is a scheming rascal. Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army. Here's an interesting question. When Saul was hunting David the last time, and David, the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall on Saul and his men, and David slips into camp and picks up Saul's staff and goes out with it. And then they wake up, and from across the valley, he says, Abner, boy, what a sorry job you did of protecting the king. Look what I've got. And there's Saul's staff, his spear right there. Where was Abner? Saul was wounded. Where was Abner when Saul was despairing in battle and giving up and taking his own life. Saul is the king. Why wasn't Abner right there with him? Makes you wonder if maybe Abner didn't see the way things were going and skedaddled to spare his own hide. I don't know that. That's just speculation on my part, but you have to wonder, where was Abner? How did he survive and Saul and Jonathan didn't? So Abner takes Ishbosheth, one of Saul's surviving sons. They go to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. Who made Ishbosheth king? It wasn't the Lord. It was Abner. Ishbosheth was 40 years old, so he's actually a little older than David, but he only reigns 2 years. The house of Judah doesn't acknowledge him. They follow David. David is king in Hebron over Judah for 7.5 years. Well, how is it that David is king for 7.5 years over Judah, but Ishbosheth is only king for 2 years in Israel? You got 5.5 years that we can't account for there. Any thoughts? Well,
They were running amok, the northern side.
that's one way to put it. Some of them may have been, as you say, running amok.
They weren't
but-
organized.
We read this and we assume, okay, David becomes king in Hebron, and immediately Abner puts Ishbosheth in Saul's place. That's not necessarily the case. It appears that there is a time lag in these events. The men of Judah acknowledge David, but the rest of the nation doesn't. What do you have in the rest of the nation? You've got a power vacuum. Abner is the power behind the throne. Abner's trying to manipulate circumstances for himself anyway. Somewhere in this, he recognizes we've got to have a king, a rival to David. Here's Ishbosheth. I'll make him king. And Abner manages then somewhere, there's a time lag in here. We don't know how long, but there's 5.5 years to account for. So it may have been all of 5.5 years after Saul was killed before Ishbosheth becomes king. But regardless, during this time, Abner is pulling the strings, and the land recovers, and they recover possessions from the Philistines, and things settle down a little bit. And you think about, the people are dispersed back to their homes. They're not all gathered in a cluster. Well, they've got harvests to tend to. They've got livestock. They've got their lives that they've got to go on with, king or no king. So somewhere in this time frame, Abner hits on the stratagem of trying to unite everybody else under Ishbosheth so that he can pull his strings like a puppet master and continue to have his influence. And the result in the rest of chapter 2 is civil war. Civil war in Israel between Judah on one side and the other tribes on the other side. So it's 7:45. Let's stop here, take about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll have a war and settle this. Questions, thoughts, comments before we break?
Great lesson.
War.
Okay, civil war.
Because now both the nations are actually divided since they were together just before this happened.
Yeah. Now this is not the first time this has happened, but it's the first time it's happened with kings in Israel. If you go back to the book of Judges, they had civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and all the other tribes because of the wickedness of the Benjamites.
Yeah.
You go forward in time past the days of Solomon, and we're going to see periods of civil war in the days of the divided kingdom. But here you have some period. How long does it last? It's not the whole 7.5 years, obviously, but you have some period once Ishbosheth is on the throne where there's strife, Abner trying to pull Judah into Ishbosheth's orbit, and David, with God on his side, trying to prevent that happening because God's will is for all of them to serve David.
Right.
And that's what's ultimately going to happen. Other thoughts, other comments? Okay, let me pause this and we'll take 15 minutes. So let's go to war. Chapter 2, we left off with Ishbosheth being made Abner's puppet king. And now we're going to have war between the two, between Ishbosheth on the one side and David on the other. And the first proposition right out of the bat, verses 12 through 16, is let's not have a wholesale battle between the tribes of Israel and the tribe of Judah. Let's have single combat and just settle this. Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down on either side. And Abner says, let's just settle this here. Let's just let the young men compete, let them rise up. And so we'll just settle this one-on-one, mano a mano. Let's do this so that we don't have a massive battle. Well, it was a little bit of a trap. Look down here. They passed over by number 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, so they fell down dead together. Well, what did they accomplish? They killed 24 people. That didn't solve anything. They named the place Helka Hazurim at Gibeon. The battle was fierce that day. Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So you start out, let's have a limited battle, and it ends in a tie, basically. We'll wrestle, we'll settle this. Nothing was settled by the Battle of the 12s, and so a full-scale battle breaks out. Come down to verse 17. 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Asahel was swift of foot as a wild gazelle. Now, these 3 are actually nephews to King David. Zeruiah is related to him, so they're his nephews. And Asahel is a tremendously swift runner, and he takes out after Abner. And Abner didn't necessarily want to kill him. He respected Joab, the older brother, but Asahel would not let up. He would not let Abner get away. Now, Abner is at this point is an older man. Asahel is young. He's fit. He's strong. Abner can't keep this up indefinitely. And he reasons with him as they run, you don't need to fight me. And he's basically saying, I'm too important for you. But Asahel would not turn aside and be distracted by anybody else. It says, as he pursued, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Well, what's going to happen if this keeps up? Abner's older. He's going to run out of steam. Asahel's going to catch him, and they're going to have to fight. It raises an interesting possibility. Is Abner afraid of Asahel? He may well be. One of the things we don't see Abner doing is being a big hero in battle. He may well have been, in some respects, an armchair general. But at this point, He tries to reason with him, find somebody else, fight somebody your own age, as it were. And Asahel will not be turned aside. And so finally, look what happens. Verse 23, Asahel refused to turn aside. Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so the spear came out at his back. He fell there and died where he was. All who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. So as Asahel is pursuing Abner and will not let up, Abner runs him through, but it's with the blunt end of his spear. It's a brutal thing. He impales him on a staff, basically, not with the blade of the spear. And that kind of wound would cause tremendous internal injuries immediately. And of course, he fell where he was and died there. It would have been immensely painful. It also is very obvious what happened. There's no clean wound. There's a ragged wound. If the spear is still there, there's the bloody butt of the spear, which tells anybody that pauses to look at this and analyze this situation that Abner was running away. This does not look good. Go ahead. Somebody started to say something? So, Joab and Abishai pursue after him. They're not going to catch him at this point, but Abner is going to blame Joab for what happens. Abner's going to try to lay the blame on Joab for all of this, Joab being basically David's general at this point. They pursued. The sun's going down. They come to the hill of Ammah before Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the people of Benjamin gathered themselves together behind Abner and became one group and took their stand at the top of a hill. So this is not the first time that we see the Benjaminites closing ranks to defend one of their own, even when he's in the wrong. If we go back to the book of Judges, that Levite whose concubine was misused by the men of Benjamin, the Benjaminites started a civil war rather than hand over the men that were guilty of crimes. Well, for the Benjaminites, blood is thicker than anything else, it seems. So now they're going to make a stand and protect Abner, even though he's wrong. So Abner tries to reason with him. Shall the sword devour forever? Don't you know that this will end bitterly if we don't stop this? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of we shouldn't be fighting, we're brethren? And Abner is putting all the burden on Joab. Well, it wasn't Joab that started this. Notice his response at verse 27. As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would not have given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning. So Joab blew the trumpet, all the men stopped, pursued Israel no more. They didn't fight anymore. So Joab is willing to let things stop here, but it doesn't solve anything. Abner and his men run off into the Arabah, to the desert area. They cross the Jordan, go back to Mahanaim, and Joab turns back. But in this, what has Joab done? He has pointed out in front of Abner's own people, you're the one who caused this, not me. You're the one who spoke up and asked for this whole scenario that led to this situation. This whole idea of let's have 12 play war with 12, and that resulted in 24 dead. That was your idea. You started this, Abner, not me. And all Israel now is going to know that it was not David, it was not Joab, it was Abner that was responsible for this. Now, the summary of it, Joab goes back, gathers all the people together. David's lost 19 men, 20 men total. Abner and Ishbosheth lost 360 men of Benjamin, of the tribe of Benjamin. So it was a heavy defeat for Abner and his men. Now, overall, the situation was that they were already tired, all sides, exhausted. They had been reclaiming the land from the Philistines. There probably were green troops there, young men that had never been tested in battle among the Israelites. Judah's men, David's men, were rested. They had not fought any recent battles. They were well tested men. They took up Asahel and buried him in the tomb of his father at Bethlehem. Joab and his men marched all night, and day broke upon them at Hebron. They go back to King David. At chapter 3, long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. So Abner's solution to the situation, Abner's proposal to try to hold on to power is this situation at Gibeon. Let's have these 12 fight those 12. You know, you pick your guys, we'll pick our guys, and whoever wins, that'll be whose side wins. Well, nobody won. So they have this much larger battle. And all that does really is set the stage for civil war. And David's side wins and wins and wins. Now, think about the environment of this. Basically, for all 12 tribes, this is a war between David and Abner. Or this is a war between Judah and Benjamin, because Abner and Saul and Ishbosheth, they're of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, they've got the tacit backing of most of the other tribes. But how far do you have to go before it becomes obvious that Abner is pulling Ishbosheth's strings and he's trying to hold on to power? And Samuel never anointed Ishbosheth, but you know, we remember that Samuel anointed David. And David was always faithful to Saul and never attacked Saul when he could have. Saul was always trying to kill David. And now here's Saul's kinfolks just kind of carrying on in that same vein, and David's justified to defend himself now. So there's war. And David's doing well. Ishbosheth and Abner are not having a lot of success. This is going to go on for a couple of years. In the meantime, pick up down here at chapter 3 and verse 2, sons were born to David at Hebron. He's not out in the battlefield the whole time, obviously. He's got 6 sons born. Amnon, born of Ahinoam, and Eliab, born of Abigail, and Absalom, born of Maacah. So he's got 3 wives there with him. The daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur, and Adonijah, the son of Haggith, there's wife number 4, and Shephatiah, the son of Abital, there's wife number 5 and kid number 5. And then there's Ithram, born of Eglah, David's wife. He's got a whole harem there, just like most kings did in those days. And in the meantime, there's war going on. Hostile positions. It's not necessarily continuous fighting, but both sides are maneuvering and trying to bring Israelites into their orbit and get them on their side. And notice what it says. Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Abner didn't care a fig about Ishbosheth except as a figurehead. He wanted to be the one in charge. So he's making himself strong. And Saul had a concubine. Now, a concubine is kind of a second-class wife. She has her husband has all the rights and privileges of the husband, but she doesn't have all the rights and privileges of a wife. She may be a servant. She could even be a slave in the house and still be the concubine. And so Saul had this concubine named Rizpah, and Abner apparently just appropriated her for himself. And Ishbosheth confronted him about it. It was an offense to Ishbosheth. I mean, Ishbosheth is the king, at least in theory, the son of Saul. Anything that had belonged to Saul, including this woman, nominally should belong to Ishbosheth, and Abner has just appropriated her for himself. Well, that's tantamount to laying claim to the throne in his own right. In fact, we'll go on down through the life of David, and when Absalom rebels against David and David has to flee from Jerusalem, what's one of the things that Absalom does? He goes into David's concubines in the sight of all Israel. That's his claim to the throne. I have vanquished the former king, and everything that he had is now mine. Well, that's basically what Abner is doing here. And so he's angry. Am I a dog's head of Judah? And notice how Abner reacts. He doesn't deny what he did, but he puts it back on Ishbosheth and basically says, boy, I made you what you are, and I can unmake you. He makes it clear that you only rule because I allow you to. You're only king. I'm loyal to your father's house, but you're only king because I made you king. And you get down here to verses 9 and 10, the idea, a dog's head of Judah, a dog was an unclean animal. And basically he says, you've insulted me. He goes on the attack. Now, it's Abner that's the schemer and the rascal. Ishbosheth may have been, he had no claim to the throne, but Abner is the ultimate schemer and rascal here. And so he says, I made you and I can unmake you, and I will, if this is how you're going to treat me, I'll hand everything over to David. Verses 9 and 10. And at verse 11, Ishbosheth could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. He knows Abner's right. In other words, he knows who pulls the strings, and he may be the king, but he's not in charge. So at verse 12, we see that wasn't just an idle threat on Abner's part. He is, in the worst sense of the word, a politician. And he's been watching this war and seeing David getting stronger and Ishbosheth getting weaker. And, you think about it. In this scenario, there's no way for Ishbosheth to get stronger as long as Abner's in the picture. Because Abner's always going to keep him under his thumb. And so as soon as he starts to act like a king, how dare you do this? Abner's done with him. And he licks his finger, sticks it up in the wind. Man, the wind is blowing in favor of David. I need to get on that side and be on the winning side. So from verse 12 down here to verse 21, Abner makes the first move, sent messengers to David. To whom does the land belong? Make a covenant with me and I'll be on your side and I'll bring the whole nation to you. Well, that sounds good. Let's put an end to this warfare. But David has a condition. I'll agree to this, but I require one thing. And if you think about the context of this, it highlights what Abner had done to Ishbosheth with the concubine. Abner had taken one of Saul's concubines, which was tantamount to laying a claim to the throne in his own right. And if nothing else, it basically said to all of Israel, all right, folks, he may be the king, but you know who's really in charge, and it ain't him. It's not Ishbosheth. David says, I'll make an agreement with you, but here are my terms. You go get my wife that King Saul gave away to somebody else, Michal, and you bring her back to me. She's mine by right. So, this is the term. You will not see my face unless you bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come. Now, this is David's first wife. They are not divorced. She was not widowed. She had loved him. He had loved her. But Saul had taken her and given her to another man when he got mad at David, to Palti. So, David also sends messengers, formal request to Ishbosheth, to the son of Saul. Ishbosheth had to agree legally and politically because he's weak. He doesn't really have any choice. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. Her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. And Abner said to him, go, return. Get out of here. You don't need to be here. And he went. Conferred with the elders of Israel. Some of you have been seeking David as a king over you. Now bring it about. The Lord promised David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. Abner also spoke to Benjamin. And then Abner went to tell David at Hebron all that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin thought good to do. In other words, he arranges it, and then he goes and talks to the elders of the tribes and says, look, fellas, we're going to lose if we keep this up. You need to buy into David as king. And after all, David was the legitimate king. So, the agreement is made official. He goes to all of Israel except for Benjamin, which is Ishbosheth's tribe, Saul's tribe. Once he's got all the other tribes on the hook, now he goes to Benjamin and basically says, all right, fellas, you really don't have any choice. And they make the pact, they make the agreement official in verses 20 and 21. Abner comes with 20 men to David at Hebron. David receives him, makes a feast for him, and I will arise and gather all Israel to my Lord the king. They may make a covenant with you, and you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So he let him come. He treated him basically like a head of state, and sent him away without harm. But Joab wants none of this. Joab apparently was not there. They've been out raiding, And they were successful, and they bring a lot of loot back. David had already sent Abner away. And you get down to verse 25. You know, this is Joab talking to David. You know that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you and to know you're going out and you're coming in and to know all that you're doing. In other words, he didn't come here to do anything good for you. He came here to spy on you. Joab wants David to see Abner as a traitor because Joab has revenge in his heart. He wants revenge for Abner killing his little brother Asahel. And you get down to verses 26 and 27. Now, Joab leaves David's presence. First thing he does, he sends messengers, run, catch Abner. Bring him back. Tell him, we need to talk. Bring him to the cistern of Sirah. And Joab murders him. Stabs him in the stomach. He assassinates him. Well, did Abner deserve it? Perhaps. Abner was a rascal and a scoundrel, but he was not condemned. David had not pronounced judgment against him or anything of the sort. Joab had taken the law into his own hands. Abner had not killed Asahel in cold blood, so it was not murder, and Joab was not the avenger of blood, though he might have justified it to himself that way. Abner had killed Asahel in battle. So it was not murder in that sense. But what Joab did was murder, not justice. And you look down here to verses 28, 29, and 30. David hears what happened, and he says, my kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord. In other words, don't let this be blamed on me. I didn't do this. I'm not responsible for this. The blood of Abner needs to fall on Joab and on his father's house. And he puts a curse on Joab's house. Now, Abner had killed Asahel in battle defending his own life. Whether he was right or wrong in that's immaterial. He was defending himself. Asahel was going to kill him. Joab committed murder. And so David puts a curse on Joab. And look at this. This is interesting. In verses 31 to 39, this scheming rascal Joab is mourned by David. So in verse 31, David said to Joab, to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, mourn before Abner. And King David followed the bier, followed the it wasn't a casket. He followed the body being borne on a litter. And that his actions are actions that say, I'm innocent in this. And they buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner. All the people wept, lamented for Abner. Notice at verse 33, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered, as one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. Now, that as a fool dies, that's the same word, Nabal. Should Abner die like Nabal died? Well, now, how did Nabal die? Abigail's first husband. He wasn't murdered. He died in shock at what Abigail had averted. But he had been a fool. He had been a churlish, foolish man. And Abner, in some ways, had been the same way. He had been a schemer and looking out for himself, not thinking of others, just like Nabal had. And David just points out he was not, he was not a perfect man, but he wasn't convicted of anything. He wasn't in bonds. And you get down to verse 37, the people understand the implication of what David is saying. David is saying, look, I am innocent in this. I didn't cause this. I didn't order this. I'm not responsible for this. All the people, verse 37, all Israel understood that day it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner. Joab didn't act on David's orders. He wanted to be sure that everybody understood that. And then in verses 38 and 39, it's interesting. He says, in essence, look, I may be finally the new king over all of Israel, but I'm not strong enough in my position yet to punish somebody as powerful as Joab. Joab is an influential man. So he says, I'll leave it in the Lord's hands. Verses 38, 39, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? I was gentle today, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. He's talking about Joab there. He's saying, I'm not in a position yet. I haven't consolidated my position as king, so I'm not really in a position to execute justice on Joab for this murder. So I'll leave it in the Lord's hands, at least for now. Well, it's going to catch up with Joab before long. We'll get to that when we get to it. In the meantime, Abner's been murdered. David has been nominally accepted as king over all Israel now. And Ishbosheth, Abner had warned him, I'm going to hand the kingdom over to David. Well, Ishbosheth hears now this is what's happened. He hears that Abner has died and he's lost heart. He's doesn't have the courage to act as king anymore. He'd been acting all along. And Saul's son had two men, captains of raiding bands. The name of one was Baanah, and the other was Rechab, sons of Rimmon, a man of Benjamin from Beeroth. And, he's got his bodyguards, he's got his men around him. And in the meantime now, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a crippled son of his own, and that's Mephibosheth. He's mentioned here, in essence, to show that the line of Saul effectively ends with Ishbosheth. Get down to chapter 9, just jump ahead for a minute to chapter 9 and verse 13. And there, at verse 13, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. He was lame in both his feet. That's the only remnant of Saul's house after Ishbosheth dies. So we come down through here. You have Mephibosheth mentioned. He's crippled. And these captains, bodyguard basically, sons of Rimmon, Rechab and Baanah, they come to the house of Ishbosheth, middle of the day, just like they normally do. It's the middle of the day. He's taking a nap, midday snooze, maybe it's after lunch, a siesta. And what do? They came into the midst of the house as if to get wheat, as if they're going to get something to eat themselves. They stabbed him in the stomach. Then they take his head to David. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, verse 8. And they said, here's the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and his offspring. And look at David's reaction. Verses 9 and 10. When one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more now when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, how much more shall I not now require his blood at your hand this day and destroy you from the earth? David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So David, somewhere along the way, it seems, has learned that that guy back in the beginning had lied about having killed Saul. And so he reminds them now, if you think I'm going to reward you when I did that to him, you've got another thing coming. They were executed. They shed innocent blood. They had it coming. Come down to chapter 5, and actually in chapters 5 and 6, finally we're going to have national and religious unity established. Finally going to get things together at this point. So in chapter 5, now all the tribes come to David at Hebron. They come down into Judah's territory, and the representatives of all the tribes, they're on the same page now. We're your flesh, your bone. We're kinfolks. When Saul was king over us, it was always you who led, who fought for us, who was doing right by us. We know that. The Lord said to you, you shall be the shepherd of my people Israel and prince over it. We know that you were anointed, in other words. And so now we want you to be king. We will accept you as king. So they give 3 reasons for accepting him as king. Number 1, we're kinfolks. We're your flesh and bone, or bone and flesh. You're one of us. Number 2, even while Saul was still king, we know that it was you who was looking after things and taking care of Israel even when Saul was not. And number 3, we know that the Lord anointed you, that God chose you. So we get down here to verse 3. He's anointed, they anointed him king over Israel. Now, Samuel had already anointed him, but they accepted him publicly, basically, in verse 3. And he was 30 years old at that point. Now, think about this for a minute. At 30 years old, man, this guy has already done a lot of living, hasn't he?
Mhm.
He has been chased all over the hill country of Judea. He's had more than any normal man's share of war against the Philistines and the Amalekites and against his own people. And he's got a house full of wives and a house full of squalling boy kids and lands. He's got a lot on his plate at 30 years. He's just a young man still. And he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months at Hebron. And then at Jerusalem, verse 5, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Total of a little over 40 years. They accepted him. Now, jump over to 1 Chronicles chapter 12 for just a moment. Of course, Chronicles is a parallel account here. In chapter 11, you have David anointed king at Hebron, but you get down to chapter 12, and you have David's mighty men in the beginning of the chapter, and you get down here to verses 23 through 40 in chapter 12, and you have a listing of the warriors, the leaders in Israel, who made David king. These are the numbers of the divisions of the armed troops who came to David in Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul over to him, according to the word of the Lord. The men of Judah bearing spear and shield, were 6,800 armed troops. Of the Simeonites, mighty men of valor for war, 7,100. Of the Levites are not soldiers, they're priests. Of the Levites, 4,600. The prince of Jehoiada of the house of Aaron, with him, 3,700. Zadok, a young man mighty in valor, 22 commanders from his own father's house. Of the Benjaminites, the kinsmen of Saul, 3,000, who at that point kept their allegiance to the house of Saul. And then he goes through all the rest of the tribes. The point being that the whole nation embraced him at this point. Those 3,000, they had been faithful to Saul up to this point. Now they're going to cast their lot with David. His total reign is 40 years and a few months. 1 Kings 2, verses 10 through 12, 10 and 11, and 1 Chronicles chapter 3. He reigned 7.5 years in Judah, 33 years in Jerusalem. And at chapter 5 and verse 6, now we have the conquest of Jerusalem. Now this is the same, this is Salem of ancient days. This is Jebus of previous times. This is an area that Jebusites were supposed to have been driven out of, and the inhabitants of the land of Judah had not finished the job. So now David has to finish the job. The king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul." So that they said, "Look, lame and blind people can beat you. We're so fortified here. We don't even have to have good soldiers. We can have cripples and they can still win because we're so fortified." And David basically says, "Fine, we'll get up the water course into the city, and we'll beat all you lame, blind people." And they're figure of speech. They're not literally lame and blind. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David, and built the city all around from the Millo inward. The Millo is one of the gates, one of the entrances. And he became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So the lame and blind will repel you. Yeah, right. They're not so tough. Now, in this same time frame, though, jump over to 1 Chronicles chapter 11 for a minute. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 6, David does something that's it's a little puzzling from our perspective. He makes Joab the chief captain. You pick up in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, the parallel, at verse 10, "These are the chiefs of David's mighty men who gave him strong support in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel." This is an account of David's mighty men. Jashobeam, a Hakamonite, was chief of the three. He wielded his spear against 300, whom he killed at one time. Now, you keep going here, and next to him, among the three mighty men, was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ahoite. And keep going down here, and what do we discover? Eventually we come to Joab, and Joab is the first to smite the Jebusites, and David rewarded him because of that. David gives him a position of honor, even though he's not a great guy in a lot of respects. So come back over here to 2 Samuel chapter 5. And at this point, now verse 11 forward, we have David's family and David's rulership. A long treaty is established with Hiram, the king of Tyre. Hiram sent messengers to David, sent cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house or palace. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, exalted his kingdom, and so forth. So things finally settled down. He's got a treaty with a neighboring king who's on good terms with him. And Hiram, the king of Tyre, is going to be a friend to David in a lot of ways, and to Solomon after him. This is territory that was not part of Judah, or was not part of Israel's promised land. This is outside, and they're allowed to be on good terms with these folks. In the future, in the days of the divided, hold on a minute, I think somebody just set the alarm. I guess whatever they had going on, they finished and they left, not knowing that we were still
Did
here.
you catch it?
I caught it. The alarm was about to go off and I caught it just in time. So, where were we? David, things settle down finally. And so you pick up here at verse 13, and David just adds to the family now. David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem. You've got names here, and more sons and daughters were born. 11, just a whole passel of them. 11 more sons. The final count is 19 sons, 6 of them born in Hebron, 13 more born in Jerusalem. And David's got a house full of wives, a house full of concubines, and a house full of kids, which God tolerated. God did not approve. There's a big difference. Now, in verses 17 through 25, you have 2 defeats, 2 victories over the Philistines, 2 defeats of the Philistines. They hear that David has finally consolidated the kingdom. And what do? Now they're coming for him. The Philistines have it in for David because he has played the fool out of them more than once. He's made fools of them more than once. So they come down to the valley of Rephaim. Shall I go up against the Philistines? Yes. Go fight. Go to the Lord first. Here's the difference. Saul goes to battle. David goes to the Lord and asks. And verses 19, 20, 21, they win and destroy the Philistine idols with fire. Go up, I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. David came to Baal Perazim, defeated them there, and the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away and burned them up, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 14. Verses 10 through 12. But then a second battle begins. They come up to the valley of Rephaim again. And what does David do? Again, ask God first. And God has his own plan. Look at the difference here. You shall not go up. Don't go meet them head on. Go around behind them. Come opposite the balsam trees. You go around behind. When you hear the sound of marching, then rouse yourself. The Lord has gone out before you. In other words, when you hear them moving around, going, then get after them. Make haste after them. The Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. David did as the Lord commanded and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. They tremendously defeated them. And at this point then in chapter 6 is when the Ark of the Covenant is going to be brought to Jerusalem, or going to begin the process of bringing the Ark. It's not going to come directly. But they're going to move it from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. And they do it without thinking about it initially. David gathered all the chosen men of Israel. That is the princes, the heads of families, the heads of clans, the high-ranking men, all the politicians, basically. And you've got 30,000 of them. And they're going to go and get the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant's been in Kiryat Jearim a total of getting on towards 70 years now. It's been removed a time or two, but it's been in that same general area about 70 years. And you come down here to verse 3 in chapter 6. They carried the ark of God on a new cart, brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah, Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart. And here's the key to Uzzah's problem. It wasn't supposed to be on a cart. They didn't consult the Lord. And we'll see that next time as we go into this in more detail. But we are where we need to stop for the night. We've got a couple extra minutes. Comments or questions before we stop?
Wonderful, wonderful, great lesson, very detailed as usual.
Well,
Thank you, brother.
I feel like I'm just sort of rambling, but
No, you're not. It
No,
amounts to a lot.
yeah, exactly.
there is a lot here, and a lot with precedent and implication for other things.
Mhm.
Yeah, it paints a beautiful picture, of our history. And it's
Right.
very important that we, have a good understanding
Well,
for our foundation.
there are a lot of lessons to learn.
It is.
We'll have to go ahead.
I was gonna say, so David, it was kind of assumed when David became king, he had imaginations, but it was a period of time before he finally had all of.
It took time to consolidate everything.
About what you said, was 7 years?
Yeah, he was 7.5 years in Hebron, where he was king over
Judah.
just Judah, just that southern part. And so it took that time of battle and conflict and whatnot to get past Abner's ambitions.
Right.
And then, even after he is acknowledged as king over the whole nation, and then goes and conquers Jerusalem and moves to Jerusalem, at that point, we're probably 10 years in to his reign.
Wow.
But even then, now they're building a house, building a palace in Jerusalem. And, he's made a treaty with Hiram. It takes time to do all of this. And let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, bring it here where the king is, because it's way over yonder at Kiryat Jearim. We ought to have the king and the high priest and everything all together.
Right.
But they're not thinking about how they go about it. They're just, go get it.
Mhm.
And God had given very specific instructions, and they're not paying attention. Lesson to learn here.
They didn't consult the Lord first.
And in all of this, time is passing. David's raising a family and sowing the seeds of a lot of future heartache, and playing favorites among his kids. He's doing some great things, and he's doing some very foolish things all at the same time.
Yeah, because you can't be passive about them either.
No peace since David's been king.
Well, you think about it from the time that David is a teenager to the time that he becomes king over the whole nation. We're talking probably 15 years of his life, half his life, more or less. More than that, really, probably 20 years of his life. Known a lot of peace, because he starts his public role, his being in the public eye, people being aware of him. he's still a teenager when he kills Goliath. And he's in court and he's in the king's house. And then he's married to the king's daughter. And then he's out in battle against the Philistines and here and there. And then Saul is hunting him. And then he's with the Philistines. And then he's dealing with them. It's just, the guy's been at war for 20 years in one way or another. And when he's not at war, he's on the run. When he's not on the run, he's hiding out amongst heathen people. And now here he is. He's finally, everything Samuel said is finally coming true, finally coming to pass. He's king. He's in, from his point of view, it's in a good place, more or less. But it's not going to last. It's going to be up and down and up and down and up and down all his life. On one level, it's amazing that he found time to write so many Psalms. And some of them surely date from this period.
Yeah, I think a lot of fear, pain, and Thanksgiving will bring about that, especially when you feel like you're alone and you pin a note to the Lord or what have you.
You got nobody else to lean on but the Lord.
Yep.
Nobody else but the Lord. Other comments, other thoughts, other questions?
Oh, Abner's been doing some.
Yeah. Abner was a scoundrel, but then so again was Joab.
Like that.
So
he was like the right hand man, but he was nowhere in sight when Saul and Jonathan was killed. Huh?
So it seems. And then Joab is going to be more trouble than he's worth in the long run for David. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll call it class, and Lord willing, I'll see you next week.
All right, have a good one. Love y'all.
All right, y'all.
Night.
Have a
Be
good
blessed.